In the small village of St. Clair, nestled deep in the French countryside, life had changed. The year was 1943, and the shadow of war had fallen heavily over every home, every street, and every family. Nazi flags hung from the town hall, and German SS officers patrolled the cobbled streets, their boots clicking sharply against the stones. Fear had become a constant companion. Mothers whispered warnings to their children. Shopkeepers closed early and villagers spoke in hushed tones, careful not to be overheard. Yet in the center of the village there was one place that seemed untouched by the terror outside, the small convent. Its walls were white, its garden quiet, and inside the air smelled faintly of herbs and baked bread. And it was there that Sister Marguerite lived. Sister Marguerite was a quiet woman, her face soft and kind. Her eyes were gentle, the kind that made children feel safe. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though the world's chaos could not touch her. The villagers liked her. They trusted her. They never imagined that this gentle nun could hold a secret so deadly that it could shake the very officers patrolling their streets. Every day Marguerite followed the same routine. She swept the convent floors, tended the small herb garden, and baked bread in the convent oven. But what she did best was cook soup. She made it fresh every Sunday using vegetables from her garden, fresh herbs, and a secret touch that made it taste richer than anyone could imagine. Villagers often came to the convent, claiming it was her kindness that drew them, but some whispered that there was something unusual about her cooking. Meanwhile, the SS officers had made their headquarters in the old manor at the edge of the village. They were cruel, strict, and suspicious of everyone. Every so often they would march through the village, shouting at anyone who dared look at them the wrong way. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and no one dared step outside without a clear reason. But the SS officers had a weakness. They loved Marguerite's soup. The rumors of her cooking had reached their ears. They requested her to prepare a special batch every Sunday. Marguerite agreed, bowing politely, hiding her thoughts behind her gentle smile. No one could have guessed what she was planning. Not the villagers, not the officers, and certainly not the higher Nazi command who assumed a nun could never be a threat. As the first chill of winter crept into the village, Marguerite moved quietly in her kitchen. The fire crackled under the heavy black pot, the smell of vegetables filling the small room. She hummed softly, a melody so light and innocent that it could have been a lullaby. Her hands moved with skill and precision, chopping, stirring, tasting. On the surface it was ordinary work. But underneath she was preparing something extraordinary. Something dangerous. She carefully measured each ingredient, adding just the right touch of herbs and spices, always making it look as though it was simple soup. The villagers thought it was just her usual generosity. But there was more to this Sunday soup than anyone could imagine. It was a secret weapon in the form of a meal, a quiet act of rebellion in a time of fear. Outside the convent walls, the SS officers were finishing their weekly meeting. Their leader, a man known for his cruelty, was arrogant and confident. He believed he had control over everything in St. Clair, and he assumed that no ordinary person, certainly no nun, could ever challenge him. And yet, unknowingly, the officers were about to taste something that would change their lives forever. Marguerite carried the steaming soup through the village to the manor. Her steps were calm, measured, as if delivering a simple meal. No one noticed her passing. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying the faint scent of herbs and vegetables. The doors of the SS headquarters opened, and Marguerite bowed politely, placing the large pot on the polished table. The officers looked at her, some smiling, others sneering. "Sunday soup as requested," she said softly. Her voice was gentle, almost shy, yet there was an unspoken strength in her eyes. The officers laughed, making jokes about a nun cooking for them. They did not know the storm that was hidden in that pot. One officer reached for the ladle, scooping the thick, fragrant soup into a bowl. Marguerite watched silently, her face calm, revealing nothing. She turned and walked away, back into the shadows of the convent, leaving the officers to enjoy what they thought was a harmless meal. And in that moment, the village held its breath. The first Sunday soup had been delivered. A quiet nun, harmless in appearance, had stepped onto a dangerous path. One that would test courage, cunning, and the limits of human fear. One that would make her a silent hero and a deadly threat to those who ruled with iron hands. By the time the officers took their first sip, no one could have guessed the events that would follow. The pot of soup, innocent to the eye, held a secret that could change the course of lives. Marguerite returned to her convent quietly, her heart steady, her mind sharp. She knew the risks. She knew the danger. But she also knew one thing. Courage could wear the softest face, and sometimes a simple act, like serving soup, could be the most powerful weapon of all. The village waited, the cold wind blowing through empty streets, and somewhere inside the manor, the first effects of her holy soup were about to begin. Cliffhanger. The next Sunday Marguerite would prepare another batch. And this time her plan would grow bolder. The next Sunday arrived, colder than the last. Snow dusted the rooftops of St. Clair, and the villagers moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the empty streets for any sign of German officers. Fear was never far away. Each week, the SS officers grew more suspicious of the villagers' quiet behavior, but they could not see what was hidden beneath the surface: the courage of one seemingly harmless nun. Sister Marguerite awoke before dawn in the convent. The cold air bit at her face as she walked to the kitchen, yet her hands were steady, her mind clear. She had planned this day carefully. The soup she would prepare today would be the first step in her silent rebellion, the first act that could tip the balance in favor of her people. She moved quietly, her movements deliberate. She gathered vegetables from the convent garden, carrots, potatoes, onions, and rinsed them in the cold water of the stone sink. The wind outside rattled the windows, a constant reminder of the danger beyond the walls. Marguerite's heart beat steadily, but her mind was sharp. Every step mattered. One mistake could mean death. The pot sat over the fire, thick and heavy. She chopped and stirred, humbly humming a tune that sounded like a prayer. But within the humble meal, she had hidden her secret ingredient, carefully measured, lethal in a way that would leave no trace. It was an invisible weapon disguised as a gift. By mid-morning the soup was ready. It steamed gently, the smell rich and comforting, innocent to anyone who might see it. Marguerite ladled the soup into a large metal pot, secured it carefully, and prepared to deliver it to the SS headquarters. The journey was short, but every step felt dangerous. If anyone saw her carrying the pot, if anyone suspected the truth, everything could collapse. As she approached the manor, Marguerite's calm exterior hid a mind full of calculation. She remembered every detail from the previous Sunday, the officers laughing, underestimating her completely. That arrogance was their weakness. They believed she was harmless. They believed a nun could never challenge them. And that belief would be their undoing. Inside the manor, the officers were already gathered. The high-ranking officer, the same cruel man who had sneered at her last week, was impatient. He looked at Marguerite with curiosity mixed with arrogance. "Ah, Sister Marguerite," he said. "We are hungry. Don't keep us waiting." Marguerite bowed politely. "Your soup as promised," she said softly, placing the steaming pot on the polished table. Her voice carried calm authority, the kind that made one listen without question. She stepped back, careful not to draw attention to herself. The officers leaned forward, ladles in hand, eyes glinting with anticipation. The first officer took a sip, then another. He smiled, unsuspecting. The second officer followed. By the time the third officer lifted his spoon, no one suspected a thing. The soup looked ordinary, smelled ordinary, even tasted ordinary. But it was not ordinary. Each bite carried the weight of rebellion, the quiet power of a woman who refused to bow to tyranny. Outside, the villagers went about their day, unaware of the danger inside the manor. Yet some felt a strange tension in the air, an unspoken hope that someone, somewhere was fighting back. They had no idea that the source of their hope wore a nun's habit and moved quietly through their streets. Minutes passed. The officers laughed and joked, unaware of the storm brewing inside their own bodies. Marguerite watched silently from a corner, pretending to tidy the table. Her calm face betrayed nothing, but inside, she held her breath with a quiet intensity. She had to know that her plan worked. The first step was always the hardest. Then it happened. The first officer coughed sharply. His face turned pale. Confusion flickered across his eyes, replaced quickly by fear. He clutched his stomach, trying to stand, but his legs gave way. Chaos erupted. The other officers looked at him, panic spreading. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a trick, but the color drained from their faces as they realized this was no joke. Marguerite stepped back, unnoticed. She had already started her retreat toward the door, blending with the shadows. Her heart raced, but she kept her steps measured. She had not been seen, and that was all that mattered. One officer down, and the others were paralyzed with fear. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint smell of soup and smoke from the chimneys. Villagers went about their chores, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside the manor. In a few hours, word would spread of the officer's sudden illness. Rumors would fly. Fear would grow. And no one would ever suspect that the source of this mysterious power was a quiet, gentle nun named Marguerite. By evening the manor was in chaos. The high-ranking officer lay on the floor, pale and sweating. Others were cautious, fearful of the invisible threat that had struck so suddenly. The investigation would begin, questions would be asked, and suspicion would grow. But Marguerite had already vanished into the quiet night, her habit flowing like a shadow against the moonlit walls of the convent. She returned to her kitchen, quietly washing the ladles and pots, her face calm, serene as if nothing had happened. The villagers would never know the role she had played. They would continue their lives, protected by a woman they thought of as harmless. And yet, a dangerous secret had begun to take root. One meal, one quiet act had changed everything. Cliffhanger. Marguerite now knew the SS officers would be watching her more closely. But she had a plan, stronger, bolder, and more dangerous than before. The next Sunday the holy soup would strike again, and this time the stakes would be higher than ever. The morning sun rose over St. Clair, but the village was far from peaceful. News of the SS officer falling ill spread quickly through the manor. The high-ranking officer had survived the first attack, but fear had settled over the remaining soldiers like a dark cloud. They did not know what had caused it, but suspicion ran through their ranks. Every shadow, every whisper seemed dangerous. And all the while the villagers whispered too, though no one knew exactly what had happened. Everyone felt a subtle shift in power. Sister Marguerite awoke before dawn as always. The cold winter wind cut through the convent, and she wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her calm demeanor betrayed none of the tension she felt. She had succeeded once, but each success now brought greater risk. The officers would watch more closely. They would try to discover the source of this strange illness. And yet she could not stop. She had a duty to protect her village. In the convent kitchen, Marguerite moved with practiced grace. She chopped vegetables, stirred the pot, and hummed softly, a gentle tune that seemed ordinary, harmless. Yet each movement was precise, measured, a careful balance between care and deadly intent. The soup was her weapon, but it was also her shield. Each Sunday she delivered it, she risked discovery, imprisonment, or death. One mistake could undo everything. Today's delivery was more dangerous than the last. The SS officers were no longer careless. They were suspicious, alert, and watching the villagers more closely. Marguerite had to plan carefully, ensuring that nothing betrayed her intentions. Every step, every glance, every movement was a gamble. She carried the heavy pot through the silent streets, her eyes scanning for any sign of the officers. The villagers pretended to go about their chores, but many stole nervous glances toward her, wondering what she carried. They had no idea that this humble nun had already struck fear into the hearts of the SS. To them she remained gentle, kind, and unassuming, a beacon of calm in the storm of war. The manor doors opened, and the officers greeted her with suspicion rather than the arrogant laughter of last week. The high-ranking officer's eyes narrowed, sharp with curiosity. "Sister Marguerite," he said, voice cold, "we heard what happened last Sunday. Are you sure your soup is safe this week?" Marguerite bowed politely, hiding a small, knowing smile. "Of course, sir. It is my usual recipe. Nothing has changed," she said softly. Her voice carried calmness, but underneath, her mind raced. She knew she had to be more careful than ever. One misstep could mean the end, not just for her but for the villagers she protected. The officers gathered around the table, their hands hovering over the ladles, eyes darting nervously at one another. They did not realize that the real threat came not from outside, but from the humble pot of soup before them. Each spoonful was a silent rebellion, a hidden act of courage that no weapon could match. Marguerite stood to the side, her face calm, watching the officers eat. She noticed small signs of fear in their eyes, hesitation in their movements. Her first soup had worked, but now the stakes were higher. They were no longer simply eating, they were testing, watching for signs of illness. She held her breath, every second stretching into an eternity. Suddenly one officer paused, a strange pallor on his face. He coughed lightly, his hands trembling. The others looked at him, suspicion and fear creeping into their expressions. They began whispering, exchanging uneasy glances. Marguerite's heart remained steady, but inside she felt the weight of danger pressing down. The officers would investigate. They would watch more closely. And yet she could not stop. By the time she left the manor, the officers were quietly panicking. Some blamed the food, others whispered about curses or spies. But no one suspected Marguerite. To them, she was still the harmless nun, quiet and gentle, who delivered soup with a smile. Her courage was hidden behind layers of calmness and careful planning. That evening, back at the convent, Marguerite cleaned the kitchen with slow, deliberate movements. She arranged the pots, wiped the counters, and humbly set everything in its place. Her face remained serene, but her mind was sharp. She was already planning the next batch, the next strike. Each Sunday brought greater risk, but also greater opportunity. Every bowl was a gamble, and every officer who tasted her soup brought her closer to her goal. The villagers whispered among themselves, sensing something had shifted. Fear had met hope. They did not know the details, but they felt the presence of someone strong, someone brave who was willing to act when others could not. Marguerite remained their quiet guardian, invisible and unassuming, yet incredibly dangerous. As the night deepened, the wind howled through the village, rattling shutters and carrying faint scents of wood smoke and herbs. Marguerite stood at the window of the convent kitchen, looking toward the manor. The officers would watch her now. They would try to catch her in the act. But she was ready. Every step had been planned, every movement rehearsed. The danger had grown, but so had her determination. Cliffhanger. Marguerite knew the next Sunday would be the most dangerous yet. The officers were watching more closely, suspicion hung in the air, and one wrong move could expose her deadly secret. But she also knew that courage summed him. The village of St. Clair was quiet, but the calm was deceptive. Winter had fully settled and snow lay thick on rooftops and streets. The SS officers had grown cautious after the last 2 Sundays. Their fear of the mysterious illness spread among their ranks, and whispers of spies and curses reached even the higher command. No one could understand how the officers had been struck so suddenly. To the villagers, it felt like hope returning, but the danger was closer than anyone knew. Sister Marguerite awoke before dawn as she always did, her mind alert. Today, every step would be more dangerous than ever. The officers had started watching her more closely, observing the convent and her movements. Every glance from a window or shadow on the street carried the risk of discovery. Marguerite's calm exterior hid the tension tightening in her chest. One misstep, one careless word, one suspicious glance could destroy everything. She moved quietly through the convent kitchen, chopping vegetables, stirring herbs, humming softly. Her movements were precise, deliberate. Every action was calculated to appear normal, ordinary. Her eyes flicked to the window constantly, scanning the snow-dusted streets for signs of SS patrols. The quiet kitchen smelled warm and comforting, breads baking in the oven, the earthy scent of herbs, but the pot on the fire carried a deadly secret. By mid-morning the soup was ready. Marguerite carefully ladled it into a heavy pot, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. Today's batch would be the boldest yet. She would target not just any officers, but a visiting commander known for his brutality. The villagers feared him. Marguerite knew he had to be stopped. But the risk was higher than ever. If she were caught, the consequences would be severe: arrest, imprisonment, perhaps execution. As she walked through the village, the snow crunched under her feet. Every sound made her pause. Shadows seemed to move unnaturally in the soft light of dawn. Her shawl was pulled tightly around her shoulders, concealing her movements. Villagers gave her respectful nods, some whispering prayers. They had begun to sense her courage, though they did not know the full extent of her actions. To them she remained a quiet nun, humble and kind, unaware of the deadly plan hidden in her hands. When she arrived at the manor, Marguerite noticed something different. The officers were alert, watching her approach. Their eyes followed her every movement, and the high-ranking officer at the table scowled suspiciously. They had learned from last Sunday's incident. They were prepared, expecting something unusual. Marguerite's calm face betrayed nothing. She placed the pot on the polished table with a bow, her hands steady. "Sunday soup as promised," she said softly. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The commander, a tall man with cold eyes, approached her. "Sister Marguerite," he said, voice low and suspicious, "we are watching you. One wrong move and—" Marguerite bowed politely. "I understand, sir," she replied, her tone gentle. But inside her mind raced. She could feel the tension like electricity in the room. One slip of the hand, one suspicious glance, and she would be caught. The first officer lifted his spoon, hesitating for a moment before tasting the soup. Marguerite watched carefully, pretending to adjust the tray on the side. She felt the faintest flicker of fear. Would her carefully laid plans be undone? Her heart pounded, but she kept her composure. Every second stretched, every movement mattered. Then it happened. A young officer, curious and suspicious, reached for the pot, his eyes narrowing. He leaned over the soup, glancing at Marguerite. "Is this normal?" he asked. His voice trembled slightly. The commander's gaze snapped toward him, and the tension in the room escalated. Marguerite's mind raced. She could not let suspicion fall on her. With a calm gesture, she stepped closer, pretending to adjust the pot. Her hands moved naturally, steady, hiding the deadly truth. "It's my usual recipe," she said softly, voice smooth as silk. "Nothing has changed." The officer hesitated, then reluctantly took a spoonful. Marguerite backed away slowly, her eyes on the floor, her face serene. She had barely been noticed, but the close call reminded her that danger was growing. Each Sunday the officer's watchfulness increased. Each delivery of soup carried greater risk. Every bowl was a gamble, and this time she had almost lost everything. Minutes later the first officer began to feel the effects. Pale and sweating, he clutched his stomach, collapsing slightly in his chair. Panic erupted among the other officers. The commander shouted orders, demanding explanations, but no one could understand what was happening. Marguerite had struck again, but almost at the cost of being caught. She left the manor quietly, her heart still pounding. The wind whipped through the streets, snowflakes swirling around her, hiding her retreat. By the time she returned to the convent, her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear but from the tension of the close encounter. She cleaned the kitchen with deliberate calm as if nothing had happened, while her mind replayed the events over and over. Marguerite knew one thing clearly: the officers would watch her more closely now. Their suspicion had grown, their vigilance heightened. But she also knew that courage often wore the softest face, and a quiet nun could outwit even the most vigilant soldier. Every step, every glance, every act of kindness could hide a dangerous secret, and she would continue her silent war to protect her village. Cliffhanger. Marguerite now faced a new challenge. The officers were watching her every move, suspicion thick in the air. One mistake could cost her life. But the next Sunday she would prepare another batch of her holy soup, and this time the risk would be higher than ever. Would she succeed again, or would her secret finally be uncovered? The sun rose slowly over St. Clair, casting a pale winter light over the silent village. Snow crunched under Marguerite's feet as she left the convent, carrying the heaviest pot yet. Today was the most dangerous Sunday of all. The officers were more suspicious than ever. Their eyes now watched the villagers constantly, and anyone moving too boldly risked death. But Marguerite's courage did not waver. She knew the final strike had to succeed. Inside the convent kitchen, she had prepared her soup with meticulous care. Every vegetable was cut perfectly, every herb measured exactly. But today the soup was more than a meal, it was a statement, a carefully hidden weapon that would target the cruelest officer of all, the man whose orders had brought fear and suffering to the village for years. The first officer to taste this soup would set in motion a chain of events the SS could never have imagined. Marguerite lifted the steaming pot carefully, covering it with a thick cloth. Each step toward the manor was measured, silent. The snow muffled her footsteps, but she felt the weight of every glance, every patrol, every shadow. Her heart beat steadily, her mind sharp. One mistake now would be fatal. Yet there was no turning back. The villagers' lives depended on her courage. At the manor the officers were already gathered. Their eyes narrowed the moment they saw Marguerite approaching. The high-ranking officer, the cruelest of all, looked at her with suspicion sharp as a knife. "Sister Marguerite," he said, voice low and harsh, "we are watching you. No tricks this time." Marguerite bowed politely, her expression calm and serene. "Your soup as always," she said softly. Her voice carried no fear, only the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to hide. But beneath the surface her mind raced. She had to remain calm, focused, and precise. The officers leaned forward eagerly, their hands reaching for the ladles. Today the commander himself would take the first spoonful. Marguerite placed the pot carefully on the polished table, then stepped back, pretending to tidy the side dishes. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, hiding the truth that every bite was deadly. The commander lifted his spoon, eyes scanning the room suspiciously. He took a cautious bite, then another. Marguerite watched silently, her face calm as though she were simply serving a meal, unaware of the danger inside the pot. Minutes passed. The room seemed to stretch, the officers' laughter and chatter fading into tense silence. Then the first officer coughed, a harsh, strangled sound. His face went pale and he stumbled slightly in his chair. Panic spread like wildfire through the room. The commander's eyes narrowed, confusion and fear mixing in a rare expression. Marguerite remained perfectly still. She was unassuming, a gentle nun serving soup. Yet she had become the most dangerous person in the manor. Every officer felt it, the invisible power behind her calm demeanor, the deadly secret they could not see. One by one the officers began to falter. Their faces turned pale, hands clutching their stomachs, confusion spreading through the room like smoke. Some tried to call for help, but fear gripped them. No one could understand how a simple meal had caused such chaos. And still, Marguerite remained unnoticed, her face serene, her hands spotless. She had delivered the deadliest soup yet, and the manor was now in panic. Outside, the villagers carried on with their chores, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the manor. Yet hope stirred in the hearts of many, a quiet sense that someone was finally standing up to the cruel soldiers who ruled their lives. They did not know the details, but they would soon hear the news. The SS was faltering, and the source of this quiet rebellion was a nun. Back inside the manor, the commander struggled to stand. His eyes darted around, searching for a cause, a culprit. But Marguerite was gone, already retreating through the snow-covered streets, her steps light, her habit flowing like a shadow against the pale light. She returned to the convent with a calmness that belied the danger she had just faced. The kitchen was quiet, the fire crackling softly. Marguerite washed the ladles and pots, her movements deliberate, hiding her excitement and relief. One final strike had succeeded, and the officer's fear had grown to a level she had never seen before. They would be more cautious now, more paranoid, but she had shown them that courage could not be crushed, even by the most brutal soldiers. That evening she looked out over the village from the convent window. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the wind carried the faint smell of herbs and bread. The villagers were safe for now. The officers would recover, of course, but the fear she had planted would linger. One quiet nun had outwitted 50 of the most feared soldiers in Nazi-occupied France. One act of bravery had changed the balance of power, if only a little. Marguerite knew the risk was far from over. The SS would continue to watch, their suspicion growing. But she also knew that she had proven something crucial. Courage, cleverness, and determination could triumph over brute force. Even the most unassuming person could become a weapon of justice in a world ruled by fear. Cliffhanger: the manor would never forget the chaos of that Sunday. Marguerite had struck a decisive blow, but the officers would not surrender easily. The next Sundays would bring new challenges, and the quiet nun would have to remain sharper, braver, and more cunning than ever. The snow continued to fall over St. Clair, covering the village in a soft, white blanket. Yet inside the manor, the warmth of the fire could not mask the fear spreading among the officers. The events of the last Sunday had shaken them to the core. 50 SS officers had been poisoned over weeks, their pride and arrogance shattered by a threat they could not see. Panic had taken root. Suspicion hung thick in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sister Marguerite remained calm in the convent, quietly tending her kitchen. Her hands moved with the same steady precision as always, chopping vegetables, stirring soups, cleaning utensils. Yet her mind was sharp, alert. She knew that the officers would be desperate now. They would investigate more closely, scrutinize every movement, every face. One mistake could expose her secret and she could lose everything: her freedom, the safety of the villagers, even her life. The officers gathered in the manor's main hall, their faces pale, voices trembling. The commander's jaw was tight, his eyes darting from one officer to another. "Who is doing this?" he demanded, his voice harsh but unsteady. "How is this possible? A nun, she cannot be responsible." But fear had already done its work. The officers no longer laughed, no longer sneered. Every shadow seemed dangerous. Every villager's glance felt like a threat. Even the simplest tasks were now performed with caution. They could not understand the power behind the humble pot of soup. They could not see courage hiding in a gentle, unassuming nun. Outside, the villagers noticed the change too. The soldiers were no longer bold, no longer ruthless in the same way. Their footsteps were careful, their gazes wary. A few villagers whispered to each other about the strange events, about the quiet woman in the convent who seemed untouched by the fear surrounding them. Some called her a miracle, though they did not know the full story. Marguerite observed the manor from her window. She could see officers pacing inside, doors slamming, voices raised in anger and confusion. Their fear was growing, their power diminished by an invisible force they could not comprehend. She felt a quiet satisfaction, but she also knew the danger had not passed. The SS would recover. They would grow angry and clever. Every Sunday from now on would be a test of her skill, her courage, and her ability to remain unnoticed. Inside the convent, she prepared a simple meal for the villagers. Mothers and children came quietly, grateful for her kindness, unaware of the deadly battles she was fighting on their behalf. Marguerite smiled gently, offering bowls of warm soup, her eyes calm. To them she was just a nun, humble and good. But in truth, she was the shield between the villagers and the terror of the SS. Each meal she served was a quiet act of defiance, each action a step toward freedom. The officers' investigation became frantic. They interrogated villagers, searched homes, and demanded reports from their own ranks. Yet no one could provide answers. Their pride and fear blinded them. Every clue pointed nowhere, every lead ended in confusion. They had underestimated the courage of a simple nun, and it had cost them more than they could imagine. Marguerite, however, remained calm. She planned her next moves carefully. Each Sunday she would continue her work, striking subtly but decisively. The officers' fear was now a tool, a weapon she could use. Their paranoia ensured that they would hesitate, doubt themselves, and hesitate again, exactly what she needed to protect her village. As the week passed, villagers began to notice something remarkable. The oppressive weight of fear was lifting, if only slightly. Soldiers were less harsh in their patrols, hesitant to confront the villagers directly. Mothers could fetch water from the wells without trembling as much. Children could play for a few minutes longer, their laughter echoing through the snow-covered streets. And always behind it all was the quiet presence of Sister Marguerite, calm, observant, and untouchable. Yet Marguerite knew the danger was far from over. The officers' fear would eventually turn into rage. They would intensify their watch, scrutinize her every step, and try to uncover her secret. She could not fail. Every meal, every action, every gesture had to be perfect. The tiniest slip could cost her everything she had fought for. That night she sat by the convent window looking out at the manor. Smoke rose from the chimneys, curling into the dark sky. Inside the officers argued, their voices sharp and tense, while outside the village slept, protected by a woman they could not fully understand. Marguerite's heart was steady, her resolve unbroken. She had fought fear with courage, chaos with calmness, and oppression with intelligence. And she would continue to do so, no matter the danger. Cliffhanger: the officers were more desperate than ever, and the next Sunday would bring the greatest challenge yet. Marguerite would face her most dangerous task, and the line between success and disaster would be thinner than ever. One misstep could expose her deadly secret and end the quiet war she had begun. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on St. Clair. The snow still covered the rooftops, but the sun now shone a little brighter, and the air carried a faint hint of spring. The village, once heavy with fear, now moved with quiet hope. Mothers whispered prayers, children played in the streets, and the harsh footsteps of soldiers seemed less threatening. Yet behind this calm, the story of courage and cunning had unfolded, largely unknown to the villagers themselves. Sister Marguerite continued her daily routines at the convent. She swept floors, tended the herb garden, and baked bread. Her face remained gentle, her eyes calm, but her mind was sharp, always aware of the danger that still lingered. She had faced the SS officers multiple times, each week delivering her Sunday soup, with courage and precision. She had outwitted 50 of the most feared soldiers in Nazi-occupied France. The manor had been thrown into chaos, officers trembling with suspicion and fear, unable to uncover the source of their misfortune. The villagers never knew exactly what had happened. They noticed a change. Soldiers were less cruel, less bold, but they could not comprehend how a single nun could shift the balance of power. To them, Marguerite remained simply a quiet, humble woman who cared for the village. Yet in truth, she had become their secret protector, their silent warrior against oppression. Inside the manor, the officers struggled to regain control. They recovered physically, but their pride had been shattered. The high-ranking commander, once arrogant and cruel, now hesitated at every decision, doubting his own judgment. Fear had taken root in the hearts of those who had once ruled with iron hands. One unassuming nun had changed the course of their authority, leaving them powerless against a force they could not see. Marguerite, however, did not dwell on her victories. She knew that courage required constant vigilance. Each Sunday soup had been a test, not just of her skill but of her resolve. She had learned patience, careful planning, and the power of subtlety. Even in the face of danger, she remained calm, calculating, and determined. Every ingredient in her soup had been a weapon, and every step she took was measured against the risk of discovery. Word began to spread quietly among the villagers. Tales of a nun who dared to challenge the SS circulated in whispers, stories told from one home to another. Some spoke of miracles, some of bravery. And though Marguerite never claimed credit, her actions inspired hope in a village that had almost forgotten how it felt to be free. Courage, they learned, could come from the most unexpected people. The SS officers eventually left St. Clair, transferred to other locations, their pride broken and their fear lingering. They would tell tales of a mysterious figure who had outwitted them at every turn. To the outside world it was a mystery, but for Marguerite and the villagers, it was a quiet triumph. One woman's courage had preserved countless lives, her actions hidden behind a veil of kindness and humility. At the convent, Marguerite continued her daily life. Children came to her for comfort, villagers for guidance, and yet no one suspected the full extent of her bravery. Her greatest victories were invisible yet profound. She had fought with intelligence, cunning, and unwavering determination. Every bowl of soup she served had been a quiet act of defiance, each gesture a challenge to tyranny. As the sun set over the village, Marguerite looked out over the snow-dusted streets. Her heart was calm, her mind clear. She had faced the most dangerous enemy with nothing but her wits and courage. The officers had underestimated her, assuming that a nun could never be a threat. They had been wrong. She had shown them that true power could come in the smallest, most gentle forms. In the hearts of the villagers, Marguerite became a silent hero. Her story was never written in newspapers, never told in the halls of history. Yet in every home, in every whispered prayer, her courage lived on. She had turned fear into hope, danger into opportunity, and a simple act of cooking into a weapon of justice. The convent remained quiet, a place of peace and sanctuary. Yet beneath its calm walls, the story of one brave nun lingered, a story of courage, intelligence, and defiance. Sister Marguerite had shown that even in the darkest times, one person could make a difference. One simple act, executed with care and bravery, could challenge the most powerful and terrifying forces. And so, St. Clair thrived quietly, protected by a nun whose name became legend in secret. The SS officers had underestimated her. The villagers had been saved by her courage. And the world, even if it never knew the full story, had witnessed the quiet, unstoppable power of one unassuming woman. Ending note: courage often wears the gentlest face. And sometimes a quiet nun with a pot of soup can change history.